Hey there. I was just getting some new equipment set up, getting used to everything. So, hi, I'm Jordan, Executive Director of BuildSoil, and we're a nonprofit that's focused on communicating and advising and supporting and doing actions that are involving community and move us towards the capacity to address environmental issues like climate change and all the social issues that lead up to that and that affect that. We are called Build Soil because soil is this indicator that lets you know that other things in the human and natural system are functioning properly. When we're doing well with each other, when we're doing well with the planet, soil is the result. And so we're going to build soil in order to move things forward. And we're also right now working on a project to get 1 million chestnut trees planted. Chestnuts are an amazing example of a keystone species in an ecosystem. And by starting with large beech family trees, we're providing a foundation so that other systems can be put in place that support people and support ecology. So I'm new to the Twitch streaming business, how this works. So forgive me as I awkwardly find my way. So I've got an update on my computer. Looks like I'm still learning how to get everything set up. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about systems of nature and culture, and we've been thinking about principles that support the design of those systems, the systems that support design. And we're going to talk more today about a couple pieces of the puzzle for understanding how to think clearly about ecosystem design and the systems around us and why they happen, why the patterns happen the way they do. This is an open chat. Please say hi in the chat. I'm reading it as we go. And also, please ask any questions. This is an interactive conversation that begins with a presentation, begins with me presenting. But let's talk back and forth with each other. I'm using threads that I've written on our Twitter account over the years, and they end up being really nice little slideshows that let me begin the conversation. So this is an opportunity for people who follow the account, who are part of our Discord, or who just are tuning in to, ask questions and think out loud about what was raised in these threads. So it looks like we've got a few people here. Looks like we've got 4 folks. Hey, some people saying hi. Hi, Boldwater. Hi, Hemlock. Happy that you're both here. I'm learning how to use this tool better and better. So if you're interested in joining up on our Discord, I happen to put a little code on the screen here so that you can, which way is it? That way. So that you can scan your phones and join our Discord. We're having interesting conversations. There's about 550 people there right now. And the idea is that it will continually to be a workspace and place for dialogue in order to get little projects started all over the country. Maybe chestnuts, maybe mesquite, maybe something else. But we're there to help each other move forward on these projects, which often involve multiple steps and a little bit of thinking and are great skill builders for things like community organizing and other future solutions for climate change. Let's start. Ooh, interesting. The internet window is not set up the way I wanted yet. Learning Twitch. There we go. Okay. So first off, when you go to Build Soil on Twitter, one of the first things at the top is just a description of how to give, because we're constantly doing fundraising. We are entirely a community supported project at this point. We're moving towards grants and we've got some in the future. But for the last year and a half, we've been able to sustain our 1 Million Chestnut project and our other activities due to small donations. So here's how to get on our Patreon. Here's how to get on our Venmo, and here's how to get on our PayPal. And any amount helps. And also, we can do subs on the Twitch. So please tune in and pay if you're interested in supporting my efforts and the efforts of the team that helped me with this. And if you're interested in the Discord, the second thing on the list of that thread, it also includes a nice little link to get into our Discord, which I will copy right now and put into the chat. If it'll let me. There we go. So that's how you get on the Discord if you want to join up with us. And we have movie nights. We do all sorts of stuff there. Okay. So I wanted to start with a thread that a lot of people like, and also a lot of people have told me is really frustrating. So we'll see how well we can talk about it right now. I will do my best to try to decode what's happening here. So I'm making sure that we're on the screen correctly. So I begin here with a discussion of what we call energy analysis. And we use circuit diagrams of ecosystems. Here's symbols. So let's talk about energy. Now, energy is the amount of potential that's in things, right? It's the amount of action that's happening in things. You drop a ball, it's releasing energy. You lift that ball up, it's holding potential energy, the capacity to release. In our bodies, we're constantly burning and using energy. So it's really intuitive of us to think about the amount of energy that something has in it. Now, here's a thought. You have a book, and you have a block of wood, same size, same weight. Now, paper's originally made from wood, right? And the wood is wood. Both of them have the exact same amount of energy in them. If you burn them, they give off the exact same amount of heat. But we know that a book is different than a piece of wood, right? The book was a piece of wood at one point, but things happened to it, right? It was chopped down, it was smashed, it was mushed, it was manufactured into paper. Now, that process came about through tiny bits of energy expended over thousands of years of learning how to, squish papyrus and make paper and make the printing press. So the tiny bits, little slivers of energy from the past are present in that. There's also the development of the language, the work of the author, the lunches that the author made, the process of growing up and learning English, the scholarship that let them get the publishing. So in some ways, the transformation of that block of wood to that book requires inputs of additional energy and materials that are now no longer in the picture and are hard to measure. Energy is the total energy expenditure of anything that's currently in our world. All processes, all things have things behind them that we don't see. And so energy is a way of calculating and looking at the total system of an ecosystem, a biosphere, a planet, an economy, a household, and asking questions about what's behind the thing. Now, somebody's saying take the whole history versus a single production. Exactly. So we can do that, but we have to diagram it out. And that's why in energy analysis, we use these circuit diagrams. So just to show you what some of the symbols are, energy analysis first came about because of Howard Odum and his brother Eugene Odum had become ecologists. And their background, especially Howard's background, HT, his background was in electrical engineering. And so when they were starting to understand the interlocking connections of things in a complex system, he already had the notation, the processes, and the mathematics that support electrical engineering, where we link things together and we understand how one serves and affects the next. So in the language system that he developed, we have all these symbols. A line represents an energy circuit. It's a pathway of energy from one thing to the other. If a wolf eats a deer, there's a line from the deer to the wolf. A source is an outside source of energy. They can be renewable or they can be limited. So if you have a big tank of water and you use that tank, you have access to it until it's gone. And then you no longer have it until you have some other way of storing it. Additional energy has to be added. But the sun, for all intents and purposes, is, it's rolling along on a time scale much larger than we are. So it's a renewable process. A tank is simply just a storage of energy, a spot between. I'm a tank in some ways for all of the ways that society feeds me. We can talk about what heat sinks are later, but for the most part, is everything in ecosystems uses up at least 50% of its energy in order to do any process, in order to have that happen at maximum power flow. So we have to tax every process in nature and understand that there's a loss at each stage, that loss is necessary for the transformation of a thing to work. An interaction is simply like one thing affects another and causes a release. And then a consumer, these little boxes here, and a producer are plants, are animals and plants. And if you looked inside of a producer, there'd be a little consumer too, because plants also use the energy that they produce. And then here at the bottom, we actually have an exchange of energy and materials for economic measurements. And so in this way, money and resources flow in opposite directions, one flowing in the opposite of the other. This language is not that important, but just to understand that there's a vocabulary of different kinds of things in nature that we can simplify as little components in a circuit system. So we assemble them. So for example, I need to make this so that the window is really good for everybody to see, because there's some diagrams, and diagrams require the respect needed to see them. Here we go. It's going to be a little bit wild and technical, but I'm going to do my best to be playful and fun in this, and please ask questions, derail me. So, here's an example of an environmental systems window, a simplified system. This window here is just saying this is a fairly closed system that we're going to be talking about. An energy source comes in, maybe this is sunlight and water and geology, and that serves and causes something to produce. A plant grows because of light and soil and water. That plant produces environmental storages of carbon, storages of wood, storages of food, berries, nuts, and some of that is consumed by consumers. Now, in our society, we have this human system, and so there's economic extraction of environmental resources, and some of that is used to be in exchange for the human economy and the exchange of money. So we have primary production, we have some sort of consumer production, and then we have an output, a relationship with a market, or relationship with human economic symbol systems. And at the same time, each of these things make sure that it continues. The consumers continue by putting back energy to production. Maybe it's wastes, maybe it is thinning, but animals affect plants to help them grow in more ongoing ways. Whether that's a pulse of eating and grazing and allowing things to grow back, or whether it's big clearing, or whether it's just literally gardening and tending. So we can wire these things together in these images. Here's an example of a wood production of 1 hectare of Swedish spruce forest in 1995. So what they did here is they showed sunlight, rain, wind, and earth. Some of that energy is, of course, not used in the ecology. It just cut leaves. But there's an energy flow, a total energy flow of 30,000 times 10 to the power of 10 solar M-joules per year. And an M-joule is a joule of solar energy, so that we can talk about it as it's being lost. We can still remember its history. So this much energy is being flowed through the system. Now, the forest is produced. It uses some of that energy in order to grow and live. And then output is logs. And after that has all happened, there's a flow of transformed energy of 7.8 times 10 to the power of 10 joules per year. So the difference here in this ecosystem is that 30,000 times 30,000 units is then transformed to only 7.8 units, but it's a different kind of substance. And that's how transformations happen in nature. So we can say the transformity, which is the ratio of what's currently present to the history of what's present. The ratio of energy to energy, 30,000 to 7.8, represents 3,846 solar M-joules per joule. Don't worry, we're going to get less technical in like a few minutes. But this idea that you can then look at everything in the world as a certain ratio between how much it's using up of the ecosystem and all the flows to what it's actually producing tells you something about how many transformations it's gone through over time. Its position in the trophic web of relationships in the ecology, the economy, the society, the biogeosphere, and the socio-biogeosphere, right? So that's rad, and allows us to then compare things that normally we could never compare before. For example, an email. Just sending an email seems like nothing. It's weightless. Even this right now seems like it's just happening magically. The transformation of my words through a computer system, through a camera to your ears, like it seems weightless, as easy as if we were in person. However, we know that there's an incredible churning engine of industrial processes, making sure that this technology is functioning. And we're sitting as like little tops of a pyramid on this gigantic industrial base, whether we realize it or not. So even the ability to be comfortable in an industrial system is a testament to how wide and vast that industrial process has become, so that it doesn't feel like a machine anymore. But that means we can compare. We can actually ask questions between those things. Is the difference here between 30,000 versus log output? Now, I don't know if it's a log output. Oh, you mean log like, I'm sorry, I was thinking mathematically. You mean in terms of the output. So is the difference here between, it's lost in the heat sink, but it's lost in every single tiny minuscule biochemical and physical process that leads to that heat sink. So it's the amount of energy that tree needs in order to grow up against gravity. It's the amount of energy it needs in order to, for every little bit of sunlight, photosynthesis uses some of that energy to do its stuff. And then what's left of that is the sugars and proteins that come out of that. And then as it uses the sugars and proteins, a lot of that is lost in order to make transformations on each step of the chain. So, oh, hey kid, we're talking about complex systems and how to understand them today. So all those minuscule changes are absolutely necessary. It turns out that if you try to increase the efficiency of a system, yeah, it's friction against system, but another way of thinking about it is imagine trying to build a house without gravity, right? Like gravity is actually important to holding a house up, even though it can also tear it down. That friction, that entropy of the system is actually a necessary part of making things function. I have a demo that I could do at some point, which I don't have on me. Maybe next time I'll do the demo. But we're able to see how the fastest flow of energy over time happens at about 50% efficiency, meaning it's a lot better when systems take in amount of energy and spit back, only some of it. They can do more overall than if they try to like efficiently transform, 800 joules to 700 joules. And usually it's a sign because most processes happen at this sort of lower efficiency and are much more powerful at lower efficiency. Usually there's somebody else has paid the cost for our pretending that we're more efficient. So every time you hear somebody talk about increases of efficiency, what they're really describing is exploitation of energy, culture, people, plants, animals, soils elsewhere, feeding off of the work of other processes that are operating at optimal power or are trying to, given, what we're up to. So this is just important basic stuff to understand. Here, if you have a system where there's a way to store energy and limiting materials, and they are applied to the processes of collecting energy, you have what's called autocatalytic growth, self-catalyzing growth. So in this one right here, we have top here is energy flows, and here's the bottom is a measure of emergy flows. So what we have going on here is we have a system where, let's say sunlight is feeding an energy transformation process. Let's call it photosynthesis in the cells of leaves. And that's being made from energy that was stored away earlier, right? The plant is building its leaves from other storages. And in order to make that worthwhile, it's also paying that energy into storage. And then that energy is being used through entropy, through animals eating it, through time. And then overall, there's like an entropic piece to it. So what ends up happening is if you have any kind of system where you have a storage, and instead of just using that storage for an additional thing, you use it to back your inputs, now you've created a loop. You can still keep feeding yourself. You can keep moving. It's like me in my, what's the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to walk out into a piece of land and start gardening it so that it can feed me, so that I can be a better gardener, so that I can expand it, so that it can feed me, so that I can be a better gardener. And that process is how all living things work. This is the autocatalytic processes are the basis of life, but they're also the basis of all self-maintaining systems like sand dunes or waves or even like the base structures of matter and energy, right? So this is important because it describes how things form patterns, but it's only half of the process as it's growth without regulation. And so when we think about things like the exponential growth of COVID, what we keep seeing is a system where it sort of like starts growing up and up and up, and then it becomes almost asymptotic, but it's exponential. And then at some point it hits a limit. There's not enough new people to infect, and it starts curving down and it goes back down. That's because there's actually kind of two processes going on. as the organism is being autocatalytic and growing exponentially until it reaches limits to its ability to grow, and then it collapses or it declines. So Lotka is this scientist who in 1920, he was trying to understand Darwin as a mathematical principle, like understand evolutionary processes as math. And so he said that there's this fourth law of thermodynamics that says that this autocatalytic process where storages of energy want to be fed just because of their nature, and they end up being selected for when they have the capacity to organize their own needs. So this is true for a lot of kinds of systems. So then Odom showed that they are embedded in systems, in these complex systems across scale. So it isn't that things are working to maximize energy or power. They're working to maximize M-power, the total energy of the system. So when you live in an ecology, when you live in a community, the optimal behavior is a behavior which improves the entire system's ability to collect and store energy. And Darwin's basic idea of the multiple wedges organizing as they try to fit into a finite niche space, or the diversity and complexity and interconnections that happen in an ecosystem. The basic principle of that, right, is that everything is autocatalytic. Everything is trying to grow for itself and ends up forcing optimizations. So we can grow a plant that grows exponentially. This thing is feeding itself, and this plant is going to take over the planet. It's just going to keep growing as long as it has food and light. However, there's a deer. So now as this plant grows, the deer grows, and as the deer grows, it eats the shrubs. And as the shrubs are fed back a little bit, their growth rate is the same, but their population is lower. So now the deer has to adjust too. And then that means that there can be more shrubs, which means there can be more deer, which means that there could less shrubs, which means that there's less deer, which is more, and these systems start to just oscillate. So we have a system of deer growing exponentially, but then reducing their own food supply, which reduces their numbers. Things oscillate up and down. So one person who got interested in this is the mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing. And he got interested in how patterns form in nature. For example, how do zebra stripes form? Why do ribs, like on our chest and our fingers, why are they repeating patterns? And he proposed something really similar to this idea of like the deer and the shrubs. So for zebra stripes, he proposed that there's these two chemicals. This is just his theory. He looked at zebra stripes and he started thinking about them mathematically. So he said, there's two substances, morphogens. One turns the stripes on, one turns the stripes off. The one that turns them on is a substance that can spread super fast, and it grows exponentially. And it actually feeds another substance that turns the color off. So shrubs growing, they turn the cells on. Deer population feeds off of it. It turns the cells off, right? And then the example here is maybe deers and wolves is better because maybe they can both move. So you've got a deer population, a wolf population, a deer population, a wolf population, and they are causing oscillations of patterns. It turns out that when you apply these mathematics, you get these things called Turing patterns, where you have two diffusing species, one activating and one repressing in a little network. And so here we go. Here's patterns that form due to the wave pattern of on, off, caused by these relating morphogens interacting with each other in a complex system, just like a food web, just like shrubs, deer, and wolves. And it turns out that his models were actually pretty accurate. We're learning more and more that the famous Hox gene seems to use this process to guide all sorts of development, including the turning on and off of bone to make a patterned hand. So here's a pattern, a wave. Our hands were originally one thing, right? We were a little like unit. And then there started to be repression where fingers started existing or not existing. And then bones started existing and not existing, on and off, as this wave pattern moved through your hand. And then another wave pattern moved again to separate the joints from each other. So this process happens everywhere. So I said, okay, but it's all about the tuning of those waves, right? You don't want to have 17 fingers on your hand, and you don't want to have like a ton of joints in your fingers. It needs to be keyed into the right harmonics. So too many oscillations and you'll have too many vertebrae or too many teeth or too many fingers. So let's return to our crash and burn system of shrubs and deer, just explosive up and down. Too much impact and then a crash and a repeat. What if we added a third autocatalytic element? One thing growing exponentially, another thing growing exponentially and lowering that, and then lowering this kind of oscillation. Well, what if you add another thing that now regulates the deer? So you have shrubs, deer, and wolves. So here's shrubs, deer, and wolves. And I can't show this video because of the world of Twitch, right? But basically, there's a famous story of wolves saving rivers in Yellowstone. So what basically happened was you had this landscape where you had gigantic herds of bison that what they do is they go into an area that already has grass and they eat it pretty quickly, but then they are really close together. They really don't want to like deal with too much, so they move on. Well, Yellowstone was having a problem where the bison and other grazers were milling. They were just like spreading out too far and too wide, and the tuning was wrong. They were eating grass a little bit here, a little bit there, and it was just like slowly wearing down the ecosystem's capacity, right? So then when wolves got added, it caused a few changes. It caused the bison to clump. Now they're hitting the ground really hard once. They're fouling the land. They're eating up all the grass, and they don't want to stay there, so they move on to the next location, giving that place ample time to recover. So now the grass can increase in population, and then eventually, as the bison have done their like rotation, they come back to that original spot, and that happens again. But the tuning of the ecosystem has been changed because of the presence of the wolves. It's adding a third autocatalytic element that makes the system a little bit more balanced, a little bit more regulating. And this just gets crazier and crazier as you add more elements to the system, more species, more diversity, and more functional diversity. So it's a great video. I recommend the little short on it. So I'll throw in one more piece of this puzzle. Imagine an ecosystem where fish grow exponentially, right? They keep growing. They want to keep feeding themselves and growing. But the more they grow, the more limiting their environment becomes. Right? It starts getting full of their waste. They start eating all of their own food. Maybe there's stress behaviors from the population getting higher. So each generation experiences the pressures caused by the eating and growth of the previous. So we have different results based on the growth rate of the fish. So we can imagine a system with different kinds of growth rates. So at low growth rates, meaning every generation maybe grows a couple extra fish per family group, right? So they're not just replacing their population, but they're growing slightly. So at low growth rates, the levels rise and bounce until they become stable. So here's an example. Over time, up and down until it stabilizes of the population of fish over several years. Here's another example of a different growth rate. It grows this much, it grows this much. Now it overshoots its carrying capacity, so it drops a little bit, adjusts, overshoots, but then comes down to this level, and eventually it stabilizes itself. But if we keep increasing that growth rate, it suddenly will bifurcate and start a permanent oscillation. So, for example, in this one, it came up and it went boop, 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 right? And you can see what's happening if you try to separate out the pattern of the growth. It's actually following this kind of process where it's constantly growing until it reaches the limits of its growth, and then it's oscillating just above and below those limits. So then higher rates will start a force cycle, not just 2, but 4, and then 8 and 16, and so on. They suddenly go into chaos. And here's a image of turning up the different R values. So as the R value gets higher and higher, the system, let's make it big. The system keeps stabilizing. It's stable. It's remaining stable. And now it's bifurcating. Now the system oscillates at this growth rate. And if it grows any higher, it's going to go chaotic. First, it's going to become 4. It's starting to become 4. Yeah, now it's 4 stages. Now it's 8, 16, and now it's in formal chaos. The ecosystem is now in a chaotic pattern. So when we see something happening like the relationship of how COVID is growing, and we're starting to see it so that it's like going up, and then now it's like hovering and going up and down, it's reaching some degree of sustainability within the population, right? So anyway, thank you for sticking with me. This is a crazy presentation, but I also think in some ways it can help us think about systems and how they work and how they function. And you think about this stuff a lot, and it's like thin coats of paint. It eventually sticks, and you start having an intuitive sense about how complex systems function. But unless you just sort of observe a lot of complex systems, it's kind of hard to internalize it. Unless, oh, there's a lot of people here. Thanks for coming by, everybody. I hope this is interesting. So if you do this, if you take all of those patterns and you graph them so that you're seeing all of the different stable states in a system, right? At low growth rates, the fish population does this, and it kind of just like finds its groove. As a little bit more, it starts doing this, and it's still there. And then at some point, it's like really going because it's growing too fast. And if you map those all out, this is what it looks like, right? Low population growth, it does nothing. It'll collapse. It collapses. There's a certain population growth where it's replacing itself. Now above that, it gets higher and higher as the growth rate increases, higher and higher until it starts doubling, and then it goes into this chaotic phase. Here's another image of the same thing. But you can see how it works. So there's also a tuning then to the growth rate of things. The R value is a process of a thing just sort of like replacing itself over and over again, and whether or not there's enough like support for that thing to happen. So this is an interesting graphic, and it tells us a lot about the behaviors of different kinds of systems. So this is a map of all possible stable states in a system where organisms can grow within limits. There is this curious thing about exponential growth within limits, though. So you're growing and you're like trying to fit in within the limits. This growth is linear growth, right? Or not linear, but it's like all in one direction. It's getting bigger, 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 bigger. But we know that not all things that grow just get bigger. They're able to fit more in a tighter space by spiraling. So, natural systems don't just always make just like a long conical horn. It's like it's useful for this organism to fold and coil because it allows for regular growth within a much more compact space. Right? Like I used to play French horn. I don't anymore, but like I could not imagine actually trying to play a French horn unrolled, You just can't do it. So let's not just think about real numbers. Let's include complex numbers. And so if you know the basics of complex numbers, the main thing to worry about is that all they do is they describe rotations. So let's talk about rotations with complex numbers. So if we take this map that we saw, here, I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger for people. If we take this map that we saw and we say, well, okay, what happens if we add this other dimension, right? Of like this like other dimension that describes all spiral patterns of growth, not just bigger and bigger patterns of growth. And we can make a map of that. Well, this is what it looks like. So that's it from one side. It's upside down. And then as we rotate it, we see all of the other spiral possibilities of growth of stable states. So this fractal is a map of all possible stable states in a 2-unit ecosystem. This is deer and shrubs or deer, and it's describing what is the potential regulatory state. What is the potential stable state of this ecology? Now, maybe you've seen this before. This is the famous Mandelbrot set, which those of us who are about my age, older millennial, every single t-shirt and binder in elementary school had this fractal on it. So yes, this is the Mandelbrot set. Just one view of all of the possible stable states for all possible growth rates of an organism. Okay, somebody's asking a question. I'll go back to it in a second. Every organism is exploring its niche, and this is the kind of complexity that results in pattern formation. So Boldwater is saying, what is this in 3D? What are the units? Okay, But let's talk about the units for a second. So first of all, it's this graph applied to this. And the units are transformed, so it's really abstract by the time you get to that fractal, but it's still describing the same process. So when the units are in this format, what it's describing is a replacement rate per population of an organism. It's like, a country where everyone has every couple has 3 kids versus a country, but not everybody's a couple, right? Might actually create a perfectly replacing population. If a third of the population is not reproductive, then it's going to be and the death rate balances out, it's going to be like about that. But you may also have a replacement where the population's growing. It's a boom town. There's lots of resources, and reproduction's happening, 4, 5, 6, 10 children per generation, that kind of thing. And then what it's saying is, where does that stabilize? Like if you only have, so much food and you're growing a population, it comes to a limit, right? This is what Malthus misunderstood, right? Malthus misunderstood. He asked the question, what happens when you have exponential growth within a finite space? And the answer is sometimes things overshoot, and other times they pattern themselves in order to match loads in order for balanced regulation. So that's what he got wrong in that topic. So that's that. And then in order to understand this, you have to understand the basics of what's going on with the complex plane. And I feel like these days people are getting the complex plane more because it's useful in machine learning and quantum physics. But to just spell it out, the complex plane is asking a question about rotation. And this isn't meant to be a super math talk, but you have the regular numbers here, and then you have the imaginary numbers. And so in order for 2 to be multiplied by 1, it has to go all the way around and becomes 2, right? In order for 2 to be multiplied by 2, it goes all the way around and ends up at 4. But in order for 2 to be multiplied and become -4, it has to be multiplied by -2. So a rotation of -2, right, gets you there. So what this does is it allows us to take items over here and multiply them over and over again in order to see how they move. So what does that mean in terms of units of reality? It's complicated, right? On one level, it can describe things like the packing of rotation, which is why we use it in computer graphics. And in the other, it can describe the overall mathematical pattern going on outside of our line of sight. It's one reason why imaginary numbers are necessary for quantum physics in order to describe oscillations, right? Describe waveforms. So we could argue that this is describing waveforms that actually are present in growth processes that are not physical stuff, but they're more like qualities. So I'm getting like out of place with this. So if you go into any place in the Mandelbrot set, you can find what's called a Julia fractal, which is a description of how things move in that particular growth pattern. So here along the normal number line, you're just seeing growth rates of the relationship of something moving along linear paths, but these are describing different kinds of rotation. All right. So that was a bit of an excursion, but I think it's important to get a sense of what happens when an autocatalytic element growing exponentially is checked by another, when you have 2 things in autocatalysis eating each other. This is happening all around us. The patterns of stable complexity in a sea of chaos. That's what's allowing our body to form out of an embryo, to make hands and fingers. It's what patterns the forest ecosystems. It's why trees are the shape the way they are. Like all of these patterns emerge because of these processes. So emergy diagrams are just like a language for starting to piece it all together. We can knit things together in a circuit diagram, just like we do in computers or in like, an organizational diagram or anything like that. So most importantly, we can begin to think about how much environmental labor goes into making of something. The wolves need a lot of deer, which needs a lot of plants, which needs a lot of sunlight. And so those wolves have a greater transformity. And here's a quote from Darwin that I really love. The face of nature may be compared to a yielding surface with 10,000 sharp wedges packed close together and driven inwards with incessant blows, sometimes one wedge being struck and then another with greater force. So Darwin read Malthus and was like, something's not right here. Like, he's not understanding the way that exponential growth functions. And so he imagined the ecosystem is almost like a barrel, right? A circle. And all of the wedges of things trying to grow exponentially are being packed into that. And that actually is the driving force behind speciation in The Origin of Species. This description of the pressures that all the organisms are putting on each other and themselves, and the necessity to select for only those things that help provide for the stability of the whole. So systems become patterned with many complex elements together because it's optimal for all of them in order to work together, to fit into that niche space. So if this is interesting to you, there's other videos that I would recommend checking out. We can get muted, so I'm going to put on mute, but I can show one of these, hopefully. So here we are zooming into this fractal and its related bifurcation diagram. And you can see that the Mandelbrot set and the bifurcation diagram are self-similar, and their patterns are in a couple different directions, right? These islands of stability, these stable states that are far apart from each other. And so similarly, we can look at, here's a good one. So what's happening here is here's an increasing growth rate of an organism. We're imagining an organism which has a higher and higher reproductive rate. And as it moves along, moves through this bulb of the Mandelbrot set, moves into the next, and now bifurcates into two states. And eventually it's going to get to a point where it's going to separate into 4. Soon it'll separate into 8. And if you actually took this and looked at it in different places in the Mandelbrot set, you would get different kinds of patterns. So nature works by tuning growth rates exactly right so that they create the kinds of waveforms and adjusting loads in their relationship to each other to create the proper waveforms that allow for things to be scaled right in order to optimize packing within finite space. So there's more to say about this. I recommend learning about it, but this is a thread that I've been posting for a while, and I kind of felt like it merited a verbal description. I don't know if that makes any more sense, but this stuff is going on behind the scenes in most complex systems as we try to understand them. And so familiarizing yourselves with them is pretty useful. And also there's a tendency to view fractals as cool patterns, and in terms of their ability to like model mountains or like look cool. But I think actually understanding that this surface is a fractal edge of how things actually work, how flow happens through a system, and also helps understand that we can't always go for more and more production. Sometimes actually there's a tuning that's perfect. That's it's not as efficient as we would want. Like, I want to clean my room and I want to get it all done really fast. Well, sometimes it's better to do like a small amount over a longer period of time because my power is actually greater then. And the same thing's true with each other, right? Like if we pace ourselves, we do small tasks first and allow them to grow slowly over time, we still get to that large result pretty quickly, but the power flows are a lot better and we don't have the crash and burn. So I think this is also a very like practical thing. What are you lolling? Repeat beat. Me cleaning my house is related to these kinds of systems. I mean, it really is like that. I mean, there's so many places where we're like trying to take an amount of energy and an amount of resources and force something to happen in the world. And you just can't, thermodynamics won't let us just like transform all of something into something else. You have to sacrifice something. You have to make something sacred, right, in all of that. And so you gotta pace it. And so sometimes it's like, what happens if I only do half of this rate? And you can tune yourself and find what is the optimal rate. This is somebody I've only recently learned how to be an effective house cleaner. And I'm not very good at it yet. But I realized it had to do with actually my expectations were too big and I was trying to be too efficient. So I want to talk about a couple more of these things. That's true. Have to accept a little bit of chaos. I'm going to talk about a couple other permaculture patterns if people are into it. So this was day 4 of a larger series of permaculture threads I did. It looks like this is mostly text, so I'll read it and we can talk. Okay, in light of the many, many slugs in my garden, today we will bring up a principle that is rooted in how we use our attention when dealing with situations and the surprises that come up. Today's permaculture principle is, the problem is the solution. So, here's me being pedantic. Okay, problems were to the ancient Greeks probalo, which that which is thrown ahead of us, an obstacle, a projecting promontory in our path. And this is a good place to start. They are a convergence of path, destination, and obstacle. Problems are a convergence of path, destination, and obstacle. I gotta tell you, I haven't read this one for like 2 years, so it's gonna be a discovery for me too. We easily see the problems ahead. People are starving. The current biosphere is dying. Too much CO2 is in the air. The house gets too hot in the summer. I'm tired. Power and resources are inequitably distributed. Any problems you're facing right now in your life, they're all problems, right? But when a solution is imagined, oh, we should have a farmer's market. Oh, people need health care. There should be gardens everywhere. What if we put a tree in front of the window? The immediate response is to stay in the mental problem space, meaning new problems and barriers are pictured until we can't start, right? Like you're trying to get through the thing and you just, what about this? What about that? This couldn't work. Oh, that would be a problem. Oh, we can't handle that. There's this sort of negativity that we naturally put when we're in the problem space because our brains are devoted towards identifying problems, which is the real problems. At one level, all of these awarenesses are right. Here, make this a little bigger. We are able to see steps and developments that prevent action. The powers that be are I don't know what I was trying to say here. The powers that be are there. Okay. People have a hard time changing. We'd have to get a permit or take a class or find someone who knows how to do that thing. Or the problem is huge. Like, how do you deal with starvation, right? How do you deal with war? How do you deal with climate change? These are huge, real problems that have gone long before us and may continue long after us, right? So the principle here is that the problem is the solution. It's forward-moving attitudinal shift that calls us to engage directly with problems and look for their two-sided nature to unlock next steps. That doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to do it, right? Some of these problems are pretty big, and I'm not going to say that like, oh, you just find the solution. But if there is a solution, it's inherent and built in the problem, and that's where we should be looking first. So there's a permaculture middle school teacher I like named Michael Becker, who's at Hood River Middle School. He's a genius designer, and he works a lot with kids, helping them learn how to become designers. He wanted to have a food grade lab for his kids, where they could sell food that they made. So they had this like lab where they were studying food. Yeah, I think so, Elderberry. Yeah, that's exactly it. So the administration said to him, "We can't do it. They would need food handlers cards. Like the kids would need food handlers cards. You can't sell food that you've made." He's like, "Great, that's a great idea." Right? He's like, "Yeah, exactly. We need to get the kids food handlers cards." Yeah, thank you. And so now the kids all have food handlers cards, which is great because, like, they can get jobs in a few years. They're prepared to start their own businesses. They're working with food and selling it and doing the math and doing the accounting. So the administration was like, "Oh no, here's a reason you can't." And he's like, "No, actually, that's the reason we can, and we're going to do it. You're right. That's the next step." So things work both ways. The problem shows us immediately what's needed. So now the students' next step was to get food handlers cards and learn the science of food safety. What's the next problem? It gets exciting. You can start eating problems. Problems are like lessons. They're actually information about what to do next. So in therapeutic context, problems are situations where the context prevents access to the solutions. Right? That can be psychological. Right? I've had so many negative experiences that I am not able to access or think about solutions right now because I'm too much in my problem. And, there's reasons for that. History. There's also like equity issues, right? Like there's a lot of solutions that are out of price range or out of class ability or out of training or education, or they're held behind other kinds of privilege and access that we have, right? So even if this could be internal, but it can also be external. There actually can be a separation of solutions out to the context that the problem exists in. The answer was never, the answers are never to just get out of the problem and stay in a better situation, right? Because that's one thing that can happen. Like, you're having a bad day, somebody cheers you up, and so now you're in a good day. You know, you've laughed, you've watched the movie, you've done the thing you love. But you didn't actually go back to the problem with this new state of mind. You just sort of moved from one room to the next. But you can stay in one, and you can get to this place where what I write here is to open the wall between them and let the solutions and the solution attitude coexist with the problem. So you have a problem. But let's just do this as an example. Think about a problem you're having right now, something like small and manageable. So you have a problem. How do you know that it was a problem? Like, what lets you know that it was a problem? What are the things that let you know that? So beyond that, how will you know when you're experiencing something better? So when you're not in the problem, what's going to let you know that you're not in the problem anymore? Okay, feel that. Like, how do you know that you're there? What does it feel like to have the problem be over? And how will you know? And what will your body feel like, right? And what will your situation be like? And how will you be acting differently? So feel that and look back at the problem you were talking about before. Has your perspective changed? How do you know that it's changed? Are you sure? How do you know? Right? And are you sure? So feel that, right? And now look back at that problem again. Notice as it changes. So that's like the structural piece of problem solving, right? I'm curious if anybody is still following after this craziness. It gives a little bit of a different perspective, right? Because usually we don't actually go back into the problem. So there's some fun sayings about this connected. You don't have a grasshopper problem, you have a turkey deficiency. You don't have a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency. So a corollary is that everything is a resource and unincorporated energy, right? So if you have slugs, it means, yeah, you got slugs, but you also don't have any sort of regulatory pattern. You have nothing regulating them. Ducks, you might have ducks somewhere else on the property and they need protein. And you've got slugs over here and they need ducks, or we need them to have ducks. And you bring those together in a new context. And so pattern becomes a way of providing a connection between a problem and a solution. But you wouldn't necessarily think of it that way unless you flipped it on its head or tried to see it in a different direction or came at it from another attitude. And so this pattern, the problem is the solution, is a space that we can fill with positive solution-based like approaches and examples. And we can ask the question like, do I have a slug problem? Okay, I do have a slug problem. What's deficient? What eats slugs? What could change the nature of this system? So here's the slug. Here's a slug problem, and here's this duck deficiency. Or I guess this is the duck deficiency, and this is the slug's problem. Huh. You don't have a fly problem, you have a dragonfly deficiency. Yeah. So this is not about accepting those problems, but approaching them as forces that can be redirected. Kids acting out with their extra energy, maybe putting them to work, helping be useful, or getting them out in nature with just enough boredom to start noticing things. Sometimes when I'm applying this principle, I feel an emotional kickback. Right? This could be really fake. And I think that's one thing. It's like people with positive attitudes that just try to like, you create your own reality. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that that's one moment that allows us to then come back and actually do the hard work of applying that. Sometimes when applying this principle, I feel emotional kickback. It's not that we need to change our minds rather than act. It's not just a mental process. It's that we need to change our minds and act. Cultivating the state of mind that will arise when the problem is solved is often a key to it. So some problems are caused by an imposition of goals without seeing the situation. right? We just have goals. We just are like, we're going to make this world fit some sort of image we have. That's imposing. It's not actually looking at the situation. Sometimes the problems are information that lets you step back and rethink it. Looks like I had a story about this. Okay. Once in a community design project, there was one neighbor who came in late and angry. He was going to block the 6 months of community engagement. Our first impulse was to ignore and push ahead with painting a huge sunflower in the street and making kiosks for community sharing. He was noticeably effective, and we started to realize he had been a community organizer 20 years before on some similar projects. We sat down to really talk and hear, and dialed back the plans until things were open enough to talk again. So when we really listened to him, we found out that he was a metal worker and really artistic, and we asked him to contribute and add to the project. And he ended up designing this gigantic metal Fibonacci spiral dome gate to the site. So what I say here is, don't take me for a liberal reformist. I don't believe that everything is debatable, and I don't believe everything comes out best through communication, though it can. Some situations need the appropriate rules. Sometimes forces are intense. Hurricanes cannot be reasoned with. Slugs definitely want to eat my beans. The marketplace of ideas doesn't work when somebody wants to kill you, right? But there are still ways of thinking about utilizing energy within that. If slug problems need ducks, what do fascist problems need? Or the leak in the roof, or gentrification, or the deterioration of a problematic democracy. Corruption, fatigue, media oversaturation, the weed in the garden. Turning all kinds of problems into solutions is the approach. We have to engage. So one person when I think about embodying this is that Michael Becker guy I was talking about before. I've never seen someone so able to navigate problems like that. Every time something goes wrong or someone puts up a barrier, he just immediately eats and digests that information and just like excitedly says, yes, how do we do that? I don't want to watch any talks because of the rules on here are a little complicated. He transformed a middle school science department into a permaculture education center, almost entirely by positive listening to the problems. And I recommend watching some videos about him. There are not, let's see what I want to say about him, because there's a lot actually I said about him. So one thing about Michael Becker that I love is, like, for example, his kids, they watched a video on aquaponics. They saw Growing Power in Milwaukee, the amazing nonprofit that was happening, that where they were building huge, city scale aquaponics systems. And they said to him, Michael, we want to build an aquaponics system. How do we do that? And he said, okay, I want you to make a list of every question you need to ask and find out in order to build this. He didn't give them a single answer, but he said, I want you to ask the questions. I want you to list what the questions are. So they went and they wrote down every question they could come up with, and they gave him a list of questions. And he was like, okay, let's start at the top. How are you going to answer this question? What do you need to know? And as they moved through, they learned engineering. They learned about pumps. They learned about the nitrogen cycle. They learned how to raise fish. They learned how to raise tomatoes. They learned how to operate. They learned how to tune. They learned how to develop experiments, alternatives. And then they were able to write a handbook and pass that off to the next class of kids who designed their own experiments and adjustments to the system. Right? So that same attitude of like, all right, what do I need to know in order to know this? What do I need to feel in order to achieve this? How will it feel when this is done? How will I be thinking when this is finished? What will I know when I've gone through this process? Those are really important questions. Maybe sometime I'll do the big thread of viewing from the future, but I've done a thread where we talk about the year 2030, 2031, and how we feel having done all this stuff, right? So it's 2030, and imagine we've actually dealt with a huge part of the blocks in the way of climate change. Don't say what those things are yet, but imagine yourself, close your eyes, and it's 2030, and you have done all the stuff you've done for the last 10 years, and in your mind, you can just look left and look right, and you can notice all of the things that are in your world, the places that you are, the smells, the colors. You can look out the window and see what the world's like out there. And in this place, 10 years from now, I want you to think back at all the changes you've gone through in the time since 2022, when you were like stuck at home a lot because of the pandemic and you weren't sure about how things were going. But imagine all of the actions that you took in order to get to a more stable world. I mean, imagine how it feels being in a place where things feel hopeful, where they feel possible. And you look back and man, it was a hard job, right? Like it was not easy. It took crisis. It took cooperation. It took conflict. It took exertions of energy. It took getting a lot wrong. It took tiny experiments building up over time. But right now, you know that you've done all those things, right? And you can feel what that's like. And you can look at your friends and think about the things you've done with them and how much you've actually achieved over the last 10 years since 2022, you know? And taking all that, feeling all that, like how's your body feel? How's your like life feel? How are your relationships? How's your capacity? What are you participating in now? And given all that, I want you to look back at yourself back in 2022 and think about what you would tell them. What would you give them? What would you have them know? And so taking all of the capacity and understanding and satisfaction and results and joy, presence that you are now, I want you to pass it back to your previous self and receive that now in the world that you're in now. Right? So that kind of process, you know, you can open your eyes if you guys are eyes closed. I'm going to go back to the slideshow, but like thinking about where we've been and thinking about where we're headed, and then we have the attitudes. Because the attitude of somebody who has seen it all and has learned how to do it is an attitude that we can start with now before we even begin. Because now we can cut to the chase. Now we can get to it. Now we can do something. So this is a little meandering today, but I do have one more point. One of the best descriptions I ever heard was from a therapist who said, emotions are a measurement that lets you know the difference between the map and the terrain. And what she meant by this was we have a mental model of the world that we're always using, expectations, stories, plans, ideas, how things are functioning. And then there's the actual world. And at any given moment, your map is not the terrain, right? So what happens when the map exceeds the terrain? Well, there's a problem there, right? The map says that a dear friend of yours is still here. You want to be able to call them. You want to be able to interact with them, but they're gone. And so now you have sadness, which is the adjustment or the rewriting of the map. Or something's in the way that wasn't on the map. Now that's like either fear or it's anger, right? There's different kinds of emotional reactions to the block. And there's also joy and elation and all that sort of over positivity that happens when the map is exceeded by the terrain. And a perfect map-terrain relationship is flow. So understanding our emotional reactions actually gives us information about the difference between our worldview and the landscape. And again, not new age processes of just sort of believing you can change the world with your thoughts. Instead, you can ask two questions. Does the map need to change or does the terrain need to change, or both? You know, like when I lost my friend, that grief is not going to work. Like I'm not going to get them back. Right? Or if something is completely lost but at the same time, there are other things that mental changes aren't enough, right? So you expect to, the world has so many injustices. I can't just adjust my brain, right? I can't just think away the world's injustices. My anger is justified, right? It's rooted in the difference between the world that I know is possible and the world that actually exists. So the only answer there is you change the world. Now, you may need to do a little bit of self-changing too to be an effective person to change the world. But you're not going to be able to just bliss your way out of economic injustice or racial injustice, right? Like that's not going to work. And if it does work, you are deluding yourself. You're just building a better bubble. So that relationship though between, do I work on the map? Do I work on the terrain? Do I do both? Is the map a tool for shaping the terrain collectively? Is the terrain an indicator of how the map needs to change or where the work needs to happen on the map? That back and forth is really interesting to me. So you had a plan to get the dishes done, but that sponge just fell behind the counter. The terrain has an impediment that wasn't on your map and you feel angry. A dear friend dies, your map still has them on it and you are sad at the loss, legitimately. And a day exceeds your map and you feel ecstatic. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote the book Flow. He talks about flow as a perfect alignment between difficulty and skill. when the map and the terrain align perfectly, we don't have emotions. We have deep, fulfilling senses of focus and purpose. So here's a situation where you have low skill and low challenge. You're not very good at the thing you're doing, but it's not that hard. You might get into it. You're working on a project. I'm very new to Twitch, but I've been like fiddling with the equipment and making sort of like okay videos. So the challenge isn't really there, right? But eventually my skills are going to get better, and I'm going to begin to become bored if I don't make improvements in the challenges. So I'll make this thing a little bit more complicated. But if this thing gets too complicated too fast, oh, I'm sorry, you don't know how to use the thing. What you would do is take a photo of it, but also I put it up in the comments, so it's up higher in the comments. Maybe it's like a couple lines up. Here, I just put it in the comments again. There's how you get to the Discord. So, things might be too complicated, and instead you feel anxiety, right? Like the thing is too daunting. Your skill hasn't improved. So we sort of do this thing where we're bouncing back and forth, between these, and keeping in that flow channel. And when you feel anxiety, it lets you know that no, it's not. I know I'm kind of, I feel the same way about certain tech. Like I still can't get a handle on what you call it, TikTok. TikTok is still just like definitely anxiety to me. When I was first on Twitter, I just wrote dumb tweets, and I was sort of here in the low level, and then I got a little bored with it, and then I like raised the challenge, and then I got really anxious, and I raised my skill, and I lowered the challenge, and I got back into the flow with it. But this also means that anxiety and boredom now are indicators. Oh, I feel anxious. I need to adjust the system, right? Oh, I feel bored. I can either adjust my skill level, or I can adjust the challenge that I'm taking on. I guess when you're bored, you really can't lower your skill level again. You already know what you know. So you find a way to become a beginner again. I think ADD, which I have, is also a process of keeping flow, not by accelerating skill, but by switching channels and trying new challenges. But that's another conversation. So if emotions are a measurement of the difference between map and terrain, it gives us two aspects that can be worked on when we experience a problem. We can work on the map. We can grieve. We can rewrite the map with loss. We can reframe things. We can understand that sponges fall, and we can be open to that. Like, the sponge did not try to piss me off. It just fell, and now you got to bend over and pick up this and like work on the dishes again. I know it wasn't your plan, but you got to adjust your map a little bit. Alternatively, we can look out at the world. My map says that everyone should have easy access to the full extent of our society's healthcare. That's not on the terrain, that's in my map. My map says everyone should have access to our society's full extent of our capacity for healthcare. In this case, the map helps us keep focused on how we change the world. The emotion and awareness of the problem is information. So, check in with your emotions. You have a problem. And ask, what does the map say here? What is actually the terrain? What is my image, and what is the reality? And then you check in with how you know if it's solved. How will you know when that problem is solved? How will you feel in your emotions? How will you feel in your body? How will you feel in your intellect and other aspects? And then look back at the problem with the attitude, the problem is the solution. I gotta go back to the problem. So much that could be said about this, but like every other principle, let's really zoom in on it today. What problems are occurring right now? Too many weeds? Look at that compost. Look at all that compost, right? You have so many weeds, now you've got an incredible compost. You have shrubs that are non-functional. Trim them and make soil with them. Right now, you can transform something that's neutral or a problem, and you can turn it into something that's a solution, right? Look at that compost. Look problems in the eye and say, yes, we will have to address that. And the door opens. What did I say here? I said, oh, good luck out there, folks. Let me know if you see this principle. I don't know if I said anything else in this thread. But to me, this is like a foundational attitude for design, right? Like in order to actually solve problems, you have to switch your state of mind over and over again. The activist witch Starhawk talks about magic actually being like the ability to change consciousness. And when I first heard that, I always thought, okay, making your own reality. And then I talked with her and she's like, no, actually it's more the opposite. It's about tuning yourself to be able to see things, to be able to act effectively in like tragic and difficult circumstances. Like, how do you deal with oppression, right? How do you deal with bad design? How do you deal with feeding your family? If you're not willing to like ask questions about like, what's the nature of the problem? Am I observing things correctly? Why do I care about these solutions? How will it feel? What am I trying to achieve? Now, being in a better attitude, look back at the problem. So I just think it's kind of important. Thanks for listening to me go through a Twitter thread. A lot of people here today. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I'm Jordan Fink, Executive Director of BuildSoil. I write a lot on Twitter, and I'm working on a website that includes a lot of this information. But meanwhile, we're trying to get 1 million chestnuts planted. As just an example, like, let's just do it. Let's just get 1 million chestnuts planted. It's getting into spring, and my chestnut trees that I had planted 2 years ago are, they're going to wake up soon. So I've been out there with my friends digging and putting them in a cold, dark space so that they can be handed out. And soon we're going to be reaching out to neighbors and organizations in Portland and offering them, getting them planted. But we also want to support people in doing similar things all over the place, like just planting a few chestnuts, and pretty soon they're growing and you're doing other things, and you literally don't have to deal with them after watering them for a few years. And then come the chestnuts for food and the chestnut festivals and the like chestnut muffins and all that stuff. So I think I want to go through one more of these if people are into it. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions before I shift gears a little bit? Nope. So grateful to be in this space. If anybody has any suggestions about making the ambiance better, I think I'm going to like make the background a little nicer to look at, not just books on the shelves. And I have a, what do you call them, like a illumination board that glows when you write on it that I made. So I might try that and be able to like diagram stuff. And also I'm hoping to start doing some interviews with friends who grew up eating chestnuts, and also people who have been involved in policy and those kinds of things. Background music. All right, kid, you're going to have to teach me about the rules. How do you put on background music without getting banned? We'll talk later. Unless you can suggest something right now that's royalty free, that's sort of like a good vibe while I read the next one. Yeah? Hey, if somebody pulls up some background music that won't get me muted, I will totally play it. Gentle, not like maybe some like post rock or something, or like classical or stream beats. Okay, I'll do this right now. I think it's good to have a good vibe, and I'd love to learn how to do that. Is this? Am I gonna get? You're sure I'm not gonna get a problems with this? Do I have to pay him money? Is there one you like so that I can just put it on without having to worry about? That's nice. Do you have a vibe of what any of these are like? Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, April's. Look, oh, this is very dramatic. What's something like, yeah, lo-fi? Is there anything here that's like legal? All right, if somebody suggests music, I'll put it on. Can you suggest a lo-fi and I'll just put it on so that I don't have to deal with it right now? This next one I'm going to do is on catching and storing energy. And it's kind of actually similar to this other one, so we'll see. It's not very long. Does it? Okay, I'm sorry. Elderberry, we can make a link sometime soon. Sorry, it's not right now. If you DM me, I'll make it available when we're done. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. It's nice to get a little bit of music in the background. Oh, it looks like I need a Spotify account, which I have actually deleted. Cool. All right. Permaculture design principle. Resources are present and flowing through any site or situation. So our permaculture principle today is catch and store energy and resources. So I used my notebook in this one. So here's energy coming from a source. And it's flowing from left to right. It's not being created or destroyed, but becoming more and more diffuse and losing its quality as it moves to a sink to become heat. That energy can just move as light, radiation, but it interacts with matter. For this conversation, we're separating matter and energy. And it works on it, moving, heating, changing, combining. All these events can be understood as linked, one leading to the next, or many. So energy gets stored in the form, physical and chemical properties, motion, elevation, interaction and information, and the patterns of matter. And so we can look at it as its path is less directional on its march to entropy. Things in nature try their best to stay out of entropic decline as much as possible. So these patterns link so much that I might be returning to examples that I've done before. But good examples include the water and nitrogen and carbon cycles, where matter, which is relatively a closed system, and heat moves in and out, an open system. So here on planet Earth, we've got water just cycling, right? At different rates of change. The oceans absorb energy and they evaporate using that solar energy. They get brought inland and they drop ice and snow, and some of that goes into the ground and infiltrates. Some of it comes out as springs, some of it goes way deep. Some of it comes out as volcanic steam, surface runoff, feeding plants, running biochemical processes. The plants are lifting it high into the air so that it can go back up. More and more water being stored by that system. And in the same way, here is nitrogen being used over and over again. Maybe it's coming in through a little bit of fertilizer, but usually it's through the action of nitrogen fixing bacteria. The plants get sunlight and they collect that nitrogen and use it to feed the bacteria. It'd be nice if there's just like a playlist attached to this. Is there just a playlist for this thing? Nope. Okay, I'll just keep coming back here and playing new ones. So nitrogen is moving through all these spaces. The nitrogen is important in proteins, and so it goes into plants. It goes into animals that use it. When they die, it feeds decomposers, and the decomposers release ammonium. The fungi are really good at releasing ammonium, which is useful for certain kinds of plants. Nitrifying bacteria transform the ammonium into nitrates. The nitrifying bacteria drop one of those, or add another oxygen and convert it into nitrates. Some of that is assimilated by plants, which cycle again and again. And some of that is denitrified by bacteria and turns back into atmospheric nitrogen. So these cycles are happening because the pool of atmospheric nitrogen gets brought into the landscape and converted over and over and over again. Some of it is just cycling, never getting lost in the soil. In the same way, carbon in the atmosphere is brought in by photosynthesis. Some of it becomes soil, some of it gets turned into phytoplankton and gets crushed over millions of years. It becomes oil, which gets burnt. All this cycle, right, happening over and over again. So when water is used as a carrier for solar energy, it arrives high on the landscape cleaned, which means it's ready to do biochemical work, or with high elevation, which means it's ready to flow downhill quickly and move things. And that work is done swiftly. It interacts with matter and patterns emerge. So here's an image of the velocity of a system and the diameter of particles and whether those particles get transported, whether they get eroded, whether they get deposited. More velocity and smaller particles, means things just move. So here's a beautiful image of is that the Yawalo River in Lapland? And we can see how it looks over time, that there's a central river, but that river has moved over time. It's changed, it's flowed. And the landscape is complex and has lots of different kinds of storage of water. So we can apply this principle of capture energy, storing and putting water to work over and over on the landscape. And we often do this with another principle of using edge. We talked about that last time. In this image from the designer's manual, water is moved back and forth across the landscape, getting every possible use from it. So normally water just sort of flows as quickly as it can to the gullies and moves off, maybe down the main river. But here we've made it so that one pond is connecting to the next, following the topography. There's gotta be some more of these. Here we go, playlists. Oh my god, these are intense. Okay. Great. In the future, here's low key. Good, good. That's what I want. Perfect. So here's a picture from the designer's manual where we've built ponds and swales that actually allow the water to still move downhill, but as slow as possible. So the water comes all the way around before it heads down. As much water use as possible every step along the way. Running water through purification systems like vegetation stores more solar energy and chemical cleanness. It's even possible to capture more energy in the form of electricity and pump the water back up. The new higher elevation water is a battery for the solar panels. And this is a good way to look at things. The lifting of objects is one of the most interesting forms of energy storage. There are companies using cement blocks or old shipping containers full of rocks to store energy. They actually take containers and they lift them up on pulleys in order to store extra energy from hydro dams or from power plants. And then they can lower that weight again and run electrical generation. And I remember one time I saw this forest where there were these alder trees. I was on this commune farm, and they took me up to this spot where they had these alder trees, and the alder trees would blow in the wind, just like that, right? And they had ropes with pulleys and winches and lifted heavy weights, a car actually, like a small burnt out old VW Bug, and it would get lifted and lifted by the swaying trees, you know, quarter of an inch at a time, no less than that. And then when they wanted to, they could release the weight slowly and run tools. They actually had tools that could run off of that. It was pretty cool. So they lowered it to run saws for their carpentry. So one way to this principle of least action for the greatest effect, the previous principle is to look for the small acts that obey observation and information to improve storages, release storages, and control storages. And I talk a little bit about that in that previous autocatalysis conversation. That's how autocatalysis works, by creating storages that then boost the performance of the original system over and over again. So in any site, any farm, any landscape, any situation, there's what we call sectors, which these are the flows coming from off-site. The sun, the wind, the cold, the heat, the noise, visitors, wildlife, fire, fog, pollution, and materials. All this stuff that's coming in at us, right? There's the bad view of our neighbors. There's the cold winds in the winter. There's the cool breezes in the summer. There's the section where sunlight comes. There's the blocked view, right? All these things are coming in. And so we work with them. Here's hot summer sun and fire-prone areas on a property. In this case, this is the southern hemisphere, so it's north-facing is where the sun is. And there's a wildlife corridor where wildlife comes in from a nearby forest. There's a view here. We look at any situation and we can map out all the different directions. Looks like I have another image here somewhere. So if a drop of water is flowing through the site and it's just used once, it only gives X amount of work, right? So if you just use a drop of water to water a plant and it leaves. But if it can be used over and over and over again and passed from one thing to another, then its impact keeps adding. So deserts are caused by not too little rain, but too much evaporation. So if you're out in the desert and... I gotta say, this music is starting to get to me a little bit. I might need to turn it off. It's like putting me in too much of a trance to think through this. So if you're in the desert and you've got, no vegetation, then almost everything that falls is going to just like run off or evaporate off. But if you have tree cover, if you have shrubs, if you have cactus, if you have all the different stuff that happens in healthy deserts, the water is retained and it's used again and again by the system. So the desert the desert, in terms of what we think of as like too much dryness, that's caused by too little, not too little water, but too much evaporation. So storage ends up improving a system that normally we'd think of as not having effective rainfall. So you see how it links to other patterns. We work efficiently in ways that allow for more capacity in the future. Of course, we need other principles to check problems of overaccumulation. You don't want to store too much, right? That causes problems too. And there are ethics of care, including this idea of redistribution of surpluses and everything extra that does not serve the system being used to give back to the larger systems that we are connected to. There's more to say about this chart in the future, but this is the adaptive cycle, and it shows how systems accumulate resources over time and potential, but at some point become overconnected, and it becomes a vulnerability for collapse. Learning how to dance with pulses is key, because a forest that overaccumulates eventually is going to burn. So this image is called the adaptive cycle, and it's describing an ecosystem pulsing the way we were talking about earlier. So what it's saying is systems over time have increased connectedness and increased potential. A low-level system. So imagine a fire has come through the forest and seeds are starting to grow and things are generally competitive. Things are fighting for resources that are open. And the best life cycle in those phases is competitive. It's growth-based. So organisms grow and grow and grow and grow. And as they do, they become more connected and they increase in their potential. And eventually they reach climax ecosystems, old growth forests, those kinds of things. And in those cases, the new opportunities aren't from exploitation and competition. They come from cooperation and finding new niches and sharing and cycling resources. So storages improve over time. But then what ends up happening is a forest that's too connected, that hasn't had enough disturbance, eventually is so connected that even a single lightning strike propagates through the forest. Well, before maybe it would only hit a particular tree. When a culture is ready to be, ready to go, to make a huge change, increased capacity, increased connection is part of growth, but then that can also become a vulnerability and can tear systems down. So a fire rages through the forest. The connectedness is lost very quickly. And then you have this funny potential that comes with things that can't get any worse. After the fire, there's no more fire potential. All there is open soil with nothing living in it. There's ash ready to fertilize things. And so the seeds that are present at that moment have a unique opportunity to be the ones that grow. And they are the ones that make the next cycle. So having political, economic, cultural, agricultural, ecological tools ready means that during little collapses, new things can be planted that otherwise it would be almost impossible to try to plant in the previous system. So I brought this up because this process of accumulation and release, the use of accumulations, the low-level burns that we have to do in a forest to keep those storages cycling back and feeding back into the whole. That's part of the dance too, right? Getting the balance of how much do I store, how much do I save. At the same time, we could go into our yards, our cities. The way we've designed most farms and cities these days is meant to bring water off of land as quick as possible, right? When my city got built, they designed a sewage system and a road system, and everything is designed to get water off and moving and out of basements as quick as possible. And then you have a problem with the sewers being overflowed, the stormwater being overflowed. And then people have to water their lawns. And in the same way, agriculture does the same thing historically, which is designed to get water off of farmland as quick as possible. So that then, now that it's been dried out, you can come in with irrigation and re-irrigate in a controlled way. So what if we stored water effectively in the positions that we want it, rather than waiting, hoping, and trying to like engineer water from somewhere else to take care of us, right? So closing loops, reuse, slowing exits, keeping resources in as high quality as possible, even capturing waste heat from compost to heat water or greenhouses, ponds, storage depots, windmills running hazelnut oil grinders, capture from every flow. This is just a video of this guy who made this little wind-powered oil press, and he's putting hazelnuts and just like drinking his beer and watching oil get made. And using at least part of our storages to improve inflows, like the first phase of holistic management chain of production, sunlight capture. Some of your labor should go to improve and secure inflows and storages. But each energy transformation takes work, many joules of energy to make a joule of another type. In complex systems, these later storages of energy are patterned by the rest on switches and leverage points. So here's another diagram of a complex system. You have lots of little things feeding smaller number of larger things, feeding smaller number of larger things, feeding one large thing. Solar energy feeds many plants, which feed a few deer, which feed less wolves, which feed maybe pumas or something, right? And each of these steps in the system is less energy, but represents far more environmental labor. And so if we discount this notion of environmental labor, if we miss the missing stuff, we do the exact same thing that happens with human labor, where the value of a thing has been completely removed from all of the labor and processes that have gone into it. So in order to really revalue and understand and appreciate what actually it takes, we have to think about the gigantic labor pool that went into the making of a very simple thing in our lives. So when I look at a piece of paper, I can see the cloud that made the rain that fed the trees, and I can see the clean water that made was involved in the paper processing to make it bleached. And I'm thinking about like the manufacturing and how I actually got this from the store, and the business processes and the oil that went into all of it, right? Layer and layer and layer and layer of systems just to make this thing exist. And you cannot separate this piece of paper from all of the other things that web together. So if this piece of paper is this one object here at the top, there's all of these other processes behind it. So practically that means no perpetual motion machines, right? Things can't cycle without some input. It means that we have to value the work that we put into a thing, an organism, a landscape, a person, an idea. So that means we also store energy, the value of the energy in front of us. This wood chip in my garden contains 40 years of tree photosynthesis. The information that you're reading now or hearing over this phone comes from my lifetime, the lifetimes of my teachers, and everything we learned from. So you're storing this message in your mind, right? So this is happening on many levels. Let's see, a few more things to cover on this principle. Things coming into our systems are the resources. Some are used by the system. Surpluses are the yield, and they can be put into creative use and succession and design and transformation. For example, the insulation against the heat loss, or the reusing of manures from animals, right? To fuel the garden. We can look at what are our wastes and recycle them back to make the inputs that we need. So yields are obtained by conserving a resource, by putting it back to work. If you have resources and you put them back to work. Some resources are a common treasury for all and must not be removed from the commons. Say that again. Some resources are a common treasury for all and must not be removed from the commons. And some belong to a group or a nation or a community or a person. And those ordered and generated by the work and knowledge and traditions of that group. There are closed practices. So resources include those which increase by modest use. So animal browsing shrubs improves the shrubs as they browse. Information is another resource that improves with use. The more you work with an idea or a concept, the more useful of a tool it is. Some resources are unaffected by use. They just exist, right? And there are resources which disappear or degrade if not used. Your annual garden is an example. If you don't use your garden, then its value goes down as the plants die out. So all of these are common to natural systems, and they're required for sustained society. In addition, there are resources which are reduced by their use, like clay or minerals or old-growth timber or fuels. There are those which pollute or destroy other resources if used, like radioactives, large use of concrete, water sewage systems that pollute the oceans. So it's important that we capture energy and resources in ways that add up to net improvement. Not all storages are net improvement. We have to make up for damage caused by any resource use, and better to ban the use to begin with if there's problems. So I just want to say, as you all look at your homes and groups and projects and contexts, and consider for yourself how you are capturing, storing, and cycling resources. And this is a principle you can use in a lot of situations. So when you're in that situation where you have a problem and you're like, okay, the problem is the solution, you might ask the question, how do I better capture resources? How do I better capture energy? Am I doing a good job of taking advantage of all the things that are flowing through this system? Oh, here's one. A good example of catching energy is street curb cuts to turn parking strips into water catchment. I love this project. So this is a project by Brad Lancaster where they have cut into the sidewalk in Tucson where things are often really dry, but there is this couple times a year, there's a big push of water, right? The monsoons. And by making cuts in the curbs, rather than that water flowing off site, it's getting pooled in these collection basins right by the sidewalk. And they're planting native vegetation, edible trees, mesquite, in order to capture and use that water. So are we capturing all the ideas? Are we taking advantage of all of the opportunities? Are we holding water as high on land as possible? Are we building soil? Those are the questions that we want to ask. Kid, thanks so much for stopping by. So I think that's everything I want to say at this moment. And I'm really curious, while we still have energy, if anybody has any comments or questions, things that we can go into in relationship to all of this. It was a lot of information. And like I said, just feel the pattern of it and, take what you need, ignore what you don't. I really appreciate having a space where we can talk about these things and explore together. Well, on that note, I think I am going to call it for the night. Hope everybody's having a great night. And thank you so much, as always, for tuning in and listening. And let me know if you have any other questions or things you want to hear about. All right, everybody. Have a great night. Oh, also, Kid, who's been a very big supporter of the project, is doing a stream tonight on, what's he talking about? He's talking about ethics and metaphysics. I have no idea what he's going to cover, but if you feel like hearing somebody talk about ethics and metaphysics, it might be interesting. He's helped me figure out a lot of the stuff around the tech, which has been really, really sweet. Hope everybody has a great night, and I'm about to get ready for bed. Okay, they're talking about Deleuze and Spinoza. All right, outside of my scope, I'm excited. Everyone have a great night. It was nice to be present with you all.